I first noticed him 3 weeks ago, though I did not know it at the time. It was subtle at first, a creeping sense of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia, the kind that sneaks up on you when the days are gray and the nights too quiet. But the feeling was persistent, gnawing at the back of my mind like an itch I could never quite reach. It started with small things, barely noticeable. Sometimes I'd feel a presence standing too close behind me when I was waiting for the train. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. Or, as I walked home from the station, I would hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps trailing behind me, always stopping when I stopped, starting when I started. Once, I thought I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow darting around a corner, just out of sight, but it could have been anyone. I tried to rationalize it away, blaming exhaustion, stress from work, or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. I could sense it. Someone, or something, was watching. Then I began to see him. The first time was at the train station, late at night. The platform was almost deserted, save for a few stragglers heading home. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sickly, greenish glow over everything. And there, at the far end of the platform, he stood. A man, though something about him was wrong, off-kilter, like he didn't quite fit into the world around him. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, his figure blurry, indistinct in the dim light. I couldn't tell you why I noticed him out of everyone else. There was nothing inherently strange about a man waiting for the train, but something about him felt wrong, like he wasn't waiting for anything at all. He was just there. I shrugged it off as nothing more than a trick of the mind, a fleeting moment of unease. I boarded the train, letting the hum of the engine and the familiar rattle of the tracks soothe my nerves. But as the train pulled away from the station, I glanced back through the window. He was still there, standing motionless beneath the flickering lights, watching. The unsettling part wasn't that he was still there. It was that I felt in my gut that he had never moved. After that night, I started seeing him more often. At first, it was subtle. He kept his distance, just another figure in the background of the city. I would catch fleeting glimpses of him in the reflections of shop windows or across a crowded street. He was never close enough to be certain. Never. So distinct that I couldn't convince myself it was all in my head. But it never felt like a coincidence. Last week, the sightings became more deliberate. It was late, far later than usual, when I left work. The streets were deserted, the city unusually still. The air was cold, biting, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. My footsteps echoed sharply off the empty buildings, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. I quickened my pace, eager to be home. Then I heard it. Another set of footsteps, just slightly out of sync with mine. I stopped, heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped too. Slowly, I turned. He was there, standing across the street beneath a flickering street lamp, bathed in its harsh yellow glow. For the first time, I could see him clearly, or at least I thought I could. His face was pale, almost luminescent, as though it absorbed the light. But his eyes were dark, bottomless voids, absorbing every flicker of light around them. They were hollow, empty, and yet I felt their gaze bore into me, cold and unrelenting. Froze, paralyzed by the sight of him. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared. My instincts kicked in, and I turned on my heel, half running, half stumbling the rest of the way home. I fumbled with my keys at the door, my hands shaking, before finally locking myself inside. My heart was still racing as I pressed my back against the door, willing my breathing to slow. I double-checked the locks and peered through the window, half expecting to see him standing outside. He wasn't there. But that didn't bring me any comfort. If anything, it made the growing dread inside me worse. The next morning, I woke to find my front door slightly ajar. At first, I thought I had simply forgotten to lock it, but a sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Nothing in the apartment appeared disturbed. Nothing was missing. But when I walked into the hallway, I saw it, a handprint, faint, greasy, and smeared across the hallway mirror. It was too large to be mine. I stood there for a long time, staring at that handprint. A part of me wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, some illusion caused by a smudge or dirt on the mirror. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message, a sign that someone, or something, had been here, watching me, close, enough to touch. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the street below, waiting for him, and he came. There he was again, standing beneath the street lamp. Only this time, he wasn't alone. The shadows around him seemed to move, shifting and writhing as though alive. They twisted and coiled in the periphery of my vision, never fully visible but unmistakably there. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer, trying to understand what I was seeing. The longer I stared, the more the world around him seemed to distort. The edges of reality blurred, as though the light itself was bending, warping around him. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed the police. But when the operator answered, all I could hear was static. I tried speaking, but my words were swallowed by the crackling noise on the other end of the line. My pulse quickened, and I turned back to the window. He was gone. The street was empty again, as though he had never been there at all. But I knew better. The days blurred together after that. I stopped going to work, stopped leaving the apartment. I couldn't bear to step outside, not when I knew he was out there waiting for me. But even inside, I wasn't safe. The presence, the sense of being watched, was stronger than ever. It clung to me, suffocating, a constant weight pressing down on my chest. 2 nights ago, the humming began. At first, I thought it was the pipes, some strange mechanical noise coming from the walls. But it wasn't. The sound was everywhere, a low droning hum that vibrated through the air, through my body. When I pressed my ear to the walls, I could hear something else beneath the hum. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers. They were too quiet to make out, but their presence was undeniable. Tried to drown out the noise, turning on every light, every electronic device in my apartment, but nothing helped. And then, the light started to flicker. At first, it was barely noticeable. A brief flicker, a moment of darkness before the bulbs steadied themselves again. But the flickers grew longer, the darkness lasting just a little too long each time. And the shadows, God, the shadows, they were moving. The flickering lights grew worse as the night wore on. Darkness would swallow the room entirely, leaving me suspended in a void where time felt meaningless. When the light returned, it brought no comfort, only the sight of shadows creeping closer, heavier and more tangible with each pulse of electricity. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the steady rhythm of my breathing. But the hum had grown louder, vibrating through my skull, setting my teeth on edge. The whispers, once faint, were now louder, more distinct. I still couldn't understand the words, but their tone was unmistakable, mocking, menacing. They were taunting me. And then the mirror shattered. The sound exploded through the silence, sharp and violent, sending shards cascading to the floor. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The fragments glinted in the dim light, and in the largest shard, I saw him. He was standing behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, heart hammering, and my stomach dropped. The reflection wasn't mine anymore. My doppelganger stared back, its mouth twisted into an impossibly wide grin, its eyes dark voids that mirrored his. As I watched, it raised a hand, slowly, deliberately. and pressed it to the glass. I felt the cold against my skin, though I hadn't moved. A note lay on my bed, scrawled in jagged, spidery handwriting. "You see me now." I didn't sleep. I didn't dare. When dawn broke, I made a decision. I had to leave. Staying here was no longer an option. I grabbed whatever I could carry and stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat as the cold morning air hit me. The hum followed me immediately, louder than ever, resonating through the pavement beneath my feet. Everywhere I looked, I saw him. In reflections on car windows, in the shifting shadows of alleyways, in the glass of storefronts, his grinning, face distorted and warped. Every time I turned, he vanished, only to reappear closer. By the time I reached the edge of the city, the hum had grown deafening. I stumbled into a field, desperate to escape the noise, the whispers, the suffocating presence that seemed to envelop me. But as I stood there, gasping for air, I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows were there, twisting and writhing at the edges of my vision. They grew thicker, darker, coalescing into something almost solid. And then he stepped out from within. Them, his form more distinct than ever, his grin stretched impossibly wide, his eyes swallowing the light around them. "You can't run," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it vibrated through my skull, echoing inside my head. "You're mine," I screamed, turning to run back toward the city, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, dragging me backward. No matter how hard I fought, no matter how fast I ran, he was always there, just ahead, waiting. I don't remember how I got back to the apartment. One moment I was outside, sprinting through the streets, and the next, I was standing in my living room, the door locked behind me. The hum was louder than ever, shaking the very walls, and the whispers filled every corner of the room. Their words finally clear. "Stay, stay, stay." The walls were covered in scratches now, deep gouges carved into the plaster. They spelled out one word over and over again. Mine. The air was suffocating, heavy with static electricity that made my skin prickle. My reflection was still, in the shattered mirror, grinning at me with that alien expression. Its eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. When I tried to look away, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I collapsed onto the floor, my hands clutching my head. "What do you want from me?" I screamed into the empty room. The hum stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. And then, a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once, answered, "You." The days have blurred into one endless night. Time doesn't work here anymore. Not the way it used to. I don't know how long I've been trapped in this place, this version of my apartment that isn't quite real. The windows show nothing but darkness, an infinite void that stretches forever. The lights no longer flicker. They're gone completely, leaving me in perpetual shadow. I see him everywhere now. He's in the corners of the room, in the reflections of the broken glass, in the shifting shapes of the darkness. He doesn't speak often, but when he does, his voice resonates through the walls, through my very bones. "You belong to me," he says. "You always have." I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The shadows are closing in, pressing against my skin, seeping into me. I feel myself changing. My reflection no longer mimics me. It moves on its own, grinning that horrible, wide grin. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself in the glass, but it's not really me. It's him, staring back, his eyes empty and endless. Tried to resist at first, but it's getting harder. The whispers are inside my head now, drowning out my thoughts. They tell me to give in, to let go. And maybe they're right. Maybe there's nothing left to fight for. I don't know who I am anymore. I look in the mirror and I see him staring back. His grin is my grin. His eyes are my eyes. The whispers have stopped now. There's no need for them. I understand what they wanted all along. I'm not the same person I was 3 weeks ago. That version of me is gone, swallowed by the shadows, replaced by something else. Something darker. Tonight, I'll step fully into the darkness. I can feel it calling to me, pulling me closer. And when I do, I'll finally understand. I'll finally belong.